Good afternoon, class. Today we'll be talking about eating disorders and how to cope with eating disorders in healthy ways versus unhealthy ways, and how to confront someone we suspect has an eating disorder in a way that is respectful to them and will help them along in their journey to recovery. Why don't we get started talking about healthy ways to cope with eating disorders? So, as many studies have shown, a big portion of coping with eating disorders has to do with managing stress. Stressful events can trigger eating disorders, such as trauma or devastating losses of loved ones, really any sort of trauma that involves causing an individual to feel like they're out of control of their life. One of the biggest things of eating disorders is that often it'll make the person suffering from an eating disorder feel like they have some sense of control over what's happening to them. So often stress will play a huge role in that control power struggle, and stress can lead to a recovering eating disorder individual relapse into the same sorts of destructive patterns. So if we consider this cartoon here for just 1 second, here's this poor blue yeti who just doesn't know what to do with himself. He's so stressed out he doesn't know what to do. And here's his brain over here in this corner telling him that he should wallow in self-pity until he can wallow no more. And then on the other side he has his stomach telling him that he should eat ice cream until he can eat ice cream no more, which for someone who's suffering from a binge eating disorder could be extremely problematic, because ice cream could be one of those foods that you could just eat and eat and eat and eat and then feel terrible about. So obviously these types of coping methods would be unsuccessful, and they're unhealthy examples of coping with an eating disorder. So again, eating disorders, coping, a large part of that has to do with stress management. So why don't we get into some of the techniques or ways that people can cope with eating disorders. This list is by no means an all-inclusive list. Really, coping has to do with what works for you as an individual. So if biking works for you, by all means you should pick up biking or join a spin class. Some people don't really like to do the journaling thing, and that's totally fine. Again, it's not a conclusive list. This really just works with you and what relieving stress means to you as an individual. So just some of these coping methods would work for some individuals, maybe not so much for others. But some of the ones that really sort of jumped out to me was getting a journal and starting to journal. Writing is a very, very huge outlet for me personally. So journaling helps me just cope with stress in everyday life. Having a support system to sort of grow, having safe people that you can talk to, friends, really coworkers, anyone that you feel safe sort of opening up to and being able to talk about just the stress in your life, being able to sort of bounce those things off of someone instead of sort of holding them in and internalizing them. That could also be bad, and it could also trigger eating disorders. So having a group of safe people definitely helps. Here is a good one for maybe someone who has like a binge eating disorder, would be to notice meal times and to notice content. So to eat when you're hungry, and to eat so much that you are no longer hungry. You don't just continue to eat and eat and eat as someone with a binge disorder might happen to do. Just really trying to be mindful of your body and your body's response to eating food, and when it's okay to stop eating food. So that's a coping mechanism, but again, maybe not relevant for all types of eating disorders. So here's another big one, is noticing the way that you speak about yourself and your body and food. So again, wanting to stay away from those sorts of negative comments about the way that you look in those jeans or that dress. Maybe you've gone out shopping with some friends and you're in a fitting room. Just being really mindful about the way that you think of yourself and the way that you speak of yourself and the way that you speak of food. So that food isn't like sort of a punishment or something that you can control. So this would be the second part of our list here. So let's jump into the second slide here. These are just a few more coping methods. We'll go through them rather quickly. One thing to do is change the subject when someone starts to talk about food or self-image. If it's something that you know bothers you, just change the subject and move on. It's better to just be mindful of your triggers and what sort of stresses you out, and to just stop it right there. Going to a movie with family or friends, that's a huge favorite of mine. Volunteering is also a really, really big outlet. Enjoyable activities with friends and family, again, like our biking example, swimming, going to the beach, and then reading to someone is also, that's a big one. That's a big favorite of mine as well. And then also choosing a hobby or taking a class like learning how to cook. So some unhealthy coping methods would be to smoke too much, drink too much, sleep too much. Really, to do anything sort of in excess or to the extreme would sort of be just like falling back into an eating disorder. It's something that you feel like you can control, and it's taking something to the extreme. So all things in moderation, some in much more moderation than others, but obviously, I mean, also this is not a comprehensive list by any means, because technically any sort of a behavior can be unhealthy if it's pushed to the extreme. So why don't we just take a couple minutes, all of us, to just brainstorm a couple coping methods we think will work with ourselves personally. Go ahead and list those on a sheet of paper, and then we can come back together as a class and brainstorm and sort of talk about what everyone has come up with. Thank you everybody for sharing. Those were some really great coping methods. You guys really sound like you have a good handle on how to cope with an eating disorder as it sort of comes at you. Those are really solid. You should definitely tuck those in your back pocket for any time that you need to manage stress in your life. Really, that's a huge skill that you'll take with you for the rest of your life. So why don't we move on to confronting a loved one about an eating disorder? This is something that really starts to get very, very sensitive for people. So on the one hand, we have a coping disorder, someone that might have an eating disorder learning to cope with it. On the other hand, alternatively, we have an individual who suspects that a loved one has an eating disorder, and they want to confront this person and talk about what they might be going through based on sorts of those signs and symptoms that we talked about earlier on in class. So if you're worried about a loved one, you should not stay silent. If you stay silent and you keep that to yourself, the eating disorder could progress, and then it becomes even harder to treat, and it becomes even more difficult to diagnose and recover from. Let's consider some of the do's and don'ts about confronting a loved one. Here is a short, really sort of uncomprehensive list of do's. So when you are expressing your concern about someone, you should really focus on your concern about their health and tell them how much you care about them. You don't want to sort of turn it into any sort of you statement. You want to keep it at an I statement. You want to say, I am worried about you. I am scared for you. You don't want to freak them out and sort of make them afraid and point any sorts of fingers. So you want to be prepared for denial and resistance. That is going to be, it's common. Someone has a problem, they don't really want to admit that it's there. So you need to realize that denial and resistance is a normal sort of defense mechanism, and be okay with that. But be persistent, be patient, and be supportive. You might not understand what they're going through, so you should be patient and supportive in what they're going through. Encourage that loved one to get help, because the earlier they get help, the better. Here's a list of don'ts. Right here we have Doug from Up. He does not like the cone of shame. That goes across the board. Nobody likes the cone of shame, so you should not point fingers or blame. You should never give an ultimatum. You should never say, if you do not get help, you cannot stay in my house. That will instill fear in a person and ultimately make them afraid, and then they wouldn't even be making the decision for themselves to get help. And really, help should come from the individual wanting to go out and seek it. You should never comment on weight or appearance and tell them you're looking so thin and you're looking so disparaged. Really, the issue here is with how they feel about how they look. So you're going to want to stay away from any sorts of comments about how they look or how they appear sickly and things like that. Again, you don't want to shame or blame. You don't want to tell them that it's their fault, that you're doing this to them, that they're doing this to you. And then you should never give a simple solution, because there is no simple solution to an eating disorder. There's no, you should just eat more, or aren't you hungry? Because really those sorts of things blur out and they just don't have any real place in that person's mind at the time that they're going through what they're going through. So just very quickly, those are the do's and don'ts of confronting a loved one. And that paired with a coping mechanism should help yourself cope with stress. And then if you have someone in your life that has an eating disorder, please remember to not stay silent about it. You want that person to get help because you love them and you care about them. So thank you.